On the day the rain began to remember the roofs, Thomas found the soft insistence at his door, a single patient wait that knew the map of his footsteps better than any letter ever had. It sat without demand, a small calculus of wait and watch, eyes like punctuation marks, tail a slow metronome keeping time with the ember of his loneliness. He had come to the shelter to sign papers, to fold grief into forms, to make room where nothing could be mended. The bell above the kennel clicked like a distant clock. It was not the look of the animal that arrested him. He knew better than to be taken by coats and markings, but the way the creature catalogued his sorrow, tilting head as if reading the edges. Shelter voices droned, numbers, protocols, a tired list of lives that had names no longer. And in the corner a hush as if someone had asked the world to be quiet, so that a small impossible secret might be heard. There were whispers about a pregnancy, a small life folded inside, a clock wound against the blunt instrument of decision. Before him lay a choice he had never wanted to face. Again. Thomas moved through his small house as if remembering how to breathe. Each room kept its own patient grammar of absence. The chair where she had once draped a shawl, the narrow ring on the tea saucer that marked Lily's thumb, the radio that seemed to search for a station that would answer in her voice. Grief had taught him the economy of small gestures. He measured his days by the distance between the kettle and the sink, by the number of steps from the front door to the old oak table, and by the way the light shifted on the rug where she had once read. He had become a man who kept habits not because they were useful but because they made his days legible. He had been a gardener of modest things, priming soil for bulbs, coaxing reluctant leaves into light, until the last winter took Lily and left the house in a kind of undone tense. The rubber plant on the sill became, without ceremony, his talisman. He watered it with the careful attention of a man who needed the reassurance that some things persist. Its glossy leaves learned his morning routine. In return, they gave him the slow, truthful reward of growth. He spoke to it sometimes in the soft voice one reserves for shrines and tender objects. The plant never answered. It only continued green and stubborn, as if to give him the fact of a future without insisting on its pleasures. It was not to the plant that he turned the day the shelter called. He had promised in a small practical way to look, not to adopt, not to rescue, simply to look. Looking, he had decided, was a form of witness that cost nothing but time. The shelter's room smelled of disinfectant and dry straw, of other people's desperate kindnesses and the faint, persistent memory of food. Volunteers moved like mariners on a long voyage of calm efficiency, clipped names, clipboards, small professional grief. There was a solidity to their form, an armor against the erosion of hope, and a softness in their hands. When he found the cat, it did not wait to be noticed. It had the habitual claim of the small animal that knows its own compass. It wound itself around his ankles as if to confirm that the world still turned. It came not with demand but with a quiet ledger of presence, an assessment in touches, a short ceremony of leaning, a slow pressure against the hand that said plainly, "Here is respite." He learned to read the creature by its behavior rather than by any catalogue of coat and eye. Its language was a series of actions that stitched meaning into the house. It did not beg. It suggested. It made itself necessary. The creature made friends with silence. It would sit at the window and watch, not with the sharpness of a hunter, but with the patient consideration of one who reads the world as if it were an old book. When Thomas spoke, it lifted its head in that curious listening tilt that seemed to weigh the value of words. It learned the hours of the house quickly, when the kettle would sing, when the light would turn soft at sundown, and oblige them with ritual. At night it slept near his feet, a warm punctuation to the sentences he had thought finished. Its breathing matched the metronome of his own, and in that company the house felt less like the edge of a thing and more like a place where repair might begin. There was a way animals know the geography of grief, an instinct of attendance that human hands mostly lack. The cat, by its behavior, mapped the seams of Thomas's sorrow. It would press its forehead against the hollow near his collarbone when he sat listless in the chair. It would paw at his sleeve as if to gather him back into tasks. When the ache grew too precise and sharp, the animal would climb onto his lap and knead as if smoothing the fabric of his chest. In the presence of that simple trust, Thomas found himself responding with small, clumsy kindnesses, warm milk, extra blankets. A chair moved slightly closer to the light. He spoke aloud more often, as if words might stitch up the holes left by silence. He began to tell the cat about the rubber plant. Lily had bought it the week their son had left for the city, when the house seemed full of unfinished conversations. She had said she liked plants because they were simple in their expectations. Water, light, patience. Thomas, who had once thought of himself as practical rather than sentimental, followed where she had pointed. He told the animal the story of how the plant had pushed out a stubborn shoot the spring after the funeral. A green promise in a season that none of them had wanted to mark with surprises. The cat listened with the measured attention of someone who keeps accounts of little mercies. It touched the pot gently with its paw, as if blessing the small thing that kept him steady. The shelter's language was a study in necessary efficiency. Volunteers explained health checks, vaccination dates, the ethics of spaying and neutering, the list of supplies a foster might need. Between precise sentences, they let slip the blunt arithmetic of their work. Beds were full. Cages must be emptied. The calendar had a hole named for the end of the month when space was accounted for. When the young volunteer said, "She's expecting," her voice kept an evenness intended to protect both parties. The phrase landed on him like a slow bird, quiet but undeniable. Expectation in an animal had once been, in his mind, a miracle. Here it was also, unavoidably, a complication. Thomas felt the world tilt slightly. Expectation in an animal was not only a miracle, but also, in the ledger of the shelter, a liability. The creature's pregnancy complicated the arithmetic. More mouths to feed meant more space taken, more risk in an already crowded system. Suddenly, the gentle contract he had made with looking was voided by the urgency of numbers. He found himself walking home with the rubber plant's shadow stretched across the pavement like an accusation, the pot's green leaves sharp against the dull. He thought of Lily's voice, how she had once told him that love was a risk, that to hold something dear was to invite sorrow. He felt the risking now as a tide. At home, the house listened. It absorbed facts as if they were rains and waited to see what they would seed. Thomas left the cat a saucer of milk out of habit, and the animal consumed it with ordinary gratitude. He watched the way it arranged itself in corners, how it selected the warm patch of carpet by the window, how it followed the arc of his day. He learned the sound of its feet on the stair like a small private metronome. Nights were given over to a kind of quiet apprenticeship in comfort. The cat, for all its practical needs, brought with it no demands for his life to be remade. It only required the ordinary things of being fed and sheltered and noticed. Those small requirements revived in him an appetite for responsibility. Grief does not relent because practical matters arrive. Yet the cat's presence introduced a new currency of attention. He found himself arranging the chair to accommodate a napper, buying a second teacup in case, and planning a small shelf for the plant in an angle of sunlight that had been overlooked for years. He made lists again, the first since the months of funeral notices and condolence cards, and items on the list read like promises: food, fresh blankets, an appointment at the clinic. Each checked box felt like a stitch in a garment he had once worn, and now was learning to mend. The town went on its own small rounds. Neighbors kept their tidy arrangements of life. The baker folded his breads into the window like a soft offering. A boy's laughter ricocheted down the street like loose coins. The rubber plant grew another leaf. Thomas felt the small satisfaction of tending a thing well, and by that tending, of quietly defying the shape of his sorrow. And yet there was always the shelter's ledger. The letter arrived on a day when the light had a merciful softness. A plain envelope, the shelter's name at the top, a paragraph of precise text explaining policies and spaces. It named a date. In that neutral sentence, the shelter compressed consequence into a single point. It informed him calmly that if no placement could be found, difficult measures might become necessary. The words were clinical, but they cut like a blade on bone. That evening, Thomas sat at the table and read the sentence until its edges blurred. He imagined the animal in a cage under fluorescent glare, its small body folded into a corner. The thought made his hands clench. He thought of the plant and of Lily's voice telling him once again that to love something was to risk sorrow, and in the quick defiance that sometimes follows grief, he resolved not to allow those numbers to be the only arbiters. If the shelter's arithmetic insisted on reducing life to numerals, then he would insert a different figure, responsibility, and with it a careful, deliberate courage. He returned to the shelter with the printed forms tucked under his arm like contraband hope. The volunteer led him through the paperwork with practiced patience. The formal promise to provide care, the schedule for clinic appointments, the agreement to return under conditions that would ensure the animal's safety. Each signature felt like binding, but it was not the kind grief had placed upon him. This was a binding made by choice, a promise to keep, to feed, to monitor, to become the steward of something that might in time create others. Thomas paused only once, pressing his pen more firmly into the paper as if the pressure could turn the sentence into an irrevocable fact. The cat walked to the threshold with him on that day, inspecting the doormat as if to take possession of the map of his rooms. It sniffed corners with the deliberate attention of one who names territory by touch. When he set it down on the kitchen floor, it wandered ceremoniously to the rubber plant's pot, and as if to make an alliance, touched the soil with a careful paw. Thomas watched the small ceremony with something like reverence. In the act of the animal meeting the plant, he felt the house tilt toward a future inhabited. At the kitchen table he put his name to the forms again, this time with a steadier hand. The shelter had given him a date in that neutral envelope, and by signing he turned the date into a promise rather than an abstract possibility. He had, in the small geometry of his afternoons, chosen to become responsible not only for one fragile life, but for the small lives it might contain. The inciting motion was as simple and decisive as that signature. The schedule that had once suggested an ending now demanded his care, and he stepped into the narrow, trembling path between mercy and necessity. If this gentle story touched your heart, subscribing keeps this quiet little corner alive. Thomas learned, in the weeks that followed signing his name, that responsibility arrives like rain, not all at once but in a quiet, insistent way that changes the grain of everything it touches. The cat, whom he had begun to call Morrow because she arrived on the cusp of a household, remade, took to the routines of the house with that sovereign calm animals have for places that ask nothing of them but give everything in return. She would patrol the windowsills as if keeping watch for weather, press her warm forehead against the rub of his palm, and then gravely go about the small matters of nesting. To Thomas, each paw print in the dust was a sentence of an argument he was learning to accept. That life asks of the living nothing less than obedience to the small mercies. The first complication was not dramatic in the way of stories, but subtle, like the way frost first shows on a leaf in winter. At the clinic, Dr. Hale, whose hands had the surety of someone who had learned to read animal bodies the way mapmakers read coastlines, found that Morrow's pregnancy was further along than anyone had thought. The small heartbeat within her pulsed stubbornly, but with a pattern that made the veterinarian's brow crease in that economy of worry reserved for things that are both hopeful and fragile. There were concerns, a tiny infection, a likelihood the kittens might arrive earlier than shelter records had suggested, a note in the file about low reserves of milk. The ramifications were careful and unromantic. Increased feed, careful monitoring, a schedule of baths and checks that read like a new calendar of obligations for Thomas. He met each instruction with the awkwardness of a man who had never before been called to keep such small lives. His hands learned new languages, how to count dewdrops of medicine, how to lift the body gently so that an animal did not mistake tenderness for fear. He found in himself an attention he had not known he had. Lily's absence became, in a way that startled and comforted him, a presence of practice, her hands teaching him in memory how to turn the page of care. But alongside the discovery of capacity came a rusted fear that the shelter's envelope might have been prophetic in other, more bleak ways, in that his promise might one day be overwhelmed by the arithmetic of mouths and the limits of the small. House neighbors observed the new habit of the house with that measured curiosity townsfolk afford one another. Mrs. Pendleton from the end of the lane, who pruned her roses like a ritual, patted the gate and said, "Animals are good medicine." Her voice carried both the authority of age and the mercy of someone who had buried more than one sorrow. The boy with the loose laugh and the baker who folded bread into the window, both offered small flourishes of kindness, leftovers of warm crusts, a soft scarf when the wind made the kitchen drafty. Each kindness was a thread that stitched him further into the world, a practical proof that rescuing was a manner of being rescued. Yet not all kindnesses were certain. The landlord, whose ledger had the final say on matters of occupancy, spoke once of regulations, and then silenced himself with a look that contained caution and inconvenience. A small, polite reminder that the world had rules that sometimes forbade tenderness. Morrow's body changed in ways Thomas watched like a map remade. Her belly deepened. The soft fur along her ribs seemed to loosen into the idea of room. She chose, with the implacable taste of catkind, a basket that had once held winter scarves and turned it into a shrine. She collected wool scraps like tokens, arranging them with a care that made Thomas think she understood the geometry of comfort. He watched her at night, the slow labor of breathing translating into a deeper patience. Watching her, he was reminded of Lily's own insistence on domestic smallness, the way she had always believed that small things, tended, could hold the world from falling apart. Obstacles accrued like small bills at the edge of a household ledger. The cost of vet care was a quiet weight. Medicines, a special food mix to encourage milk, a substitute formula for cases where nature did not keep its promises. All these read on the page in plain numbers. Thomas, who had once been a man of modest savings and careful accounts, found in himself a different arithmetic. What is the currency of compassion? He took on extra work folding linens at the community inn, his fingers learning the precise geometry of corners and hems, while his thoughts braided themselves into lists of supplies and contingency plans. He gave lectures to himself on the limits of what one man could do, and then, after the lecture, disobeyed his own counsel. He bought a second litter box with a small thrill that felt indistinguishable from pride. Complication brought with it company. Volunteers from the shelter, Jade, with a laugh that filled small rooms like wind through trees, and Marco, who had a dry way of lending assurance, became regular visitors. Jade taught him how to syringe feed the kitten formula in case Morrow's reserves failed. Marco advised on the sort of bedding that did not hold heat too tightly. They came with a kind of professional kindness that warmed Thomas more than he expected. They did not pity him. They equipped him. Each visit blurred the edges of his loneliness. He noticed, with secret gratitude, that he began to anticipate the knock at the door not because he needed help, but because the conversation, about mousetraps, about the different ways cats appeared at dawn, stopped the house from being a sarcophagus of old habits. But storms were brewing beyond the small household. The shelter's director, Marta, a woman whose face carried the map of many decisions, called one evening while rain memorably washed the gutters. She spoke in sentences that had been stripped of melodrama. There was a shortage of foster homes. The shelter's intake had doubled. They were reaching out to adopters and volunteers. Her voice had gentle urgency. She hinted, with the softest of practicalities, that if no permanent placement was found and if the kittens, should there be any, could not be placed in time, difficult choices might come sooner than any of them wished. The sentence sat in Thomas like cold stone. The possibility of loss again stalked the edges of his days. If he thought then that he could meet all needs by sheer will, an event overturned that belief. One morning Morrow appeared feverish. Her head was tucked and she refused food with a dignity that made Thomas's heart constrict. He fretted as if he had returned to the moment when the rubber plant refused to wake in a late frost. An old lesson that tenderness sometimes is not enough. He drove, hands knotted on the wheel, with a speed he had not known he possessed, to the clinic. Dr. Hale's face in the diagnostic room was the kind of face that could hold both hope and instruction without giving preference to either. The diagnosis introduced a new axis of conflict. Morrow had developed an infection that might threaten the kittens. The simplest remedy, a course of antibiotics, carried with it a risk to nursing, and the schedule to deliver care meant leaving the small hospital overnight. Dr. Hale spoke of possible outcomes in the plain language of probabilities. He also spoke of supportive care and of watchful waiting, words that are relatives of hope and anxiety. Thomas felt the two terms hitch inside his chest like birds in a single cage. He signed forms he scarcely read. He left Morrow in their hands with the sense of a man who has entrusted his last safe thing to strangers and must now stand aside. The nights became long. He sat in the kitchen with the rubber plant in the window like a green sentinel and thought of the calculus that had delivered him here, of grief and of the small rebellions of daily habit that had turned him into someone who could sign a name and keep a promise. He found himself inventing small rituals to measure time, a cup of tea at a certain hour, A letter he would write but never send to Lily. A list of the names he might choose should the kittens arrive. He spoke the names aloud as if to educate fate. Bracken, Mallow, Juniper. The act of naming was a small altar against paralysis. At the shelter, the calendar continued its indifferent turning. Marta called with news of intake records. Some animals had been surrendered when owners could no longer keep them. A truck had arrived with 6 cats whose owner had passed away and whose fate was now, like a question mark, held by the shelter. The sense of pressure built. Space was economics in a language that had no tenderness. That pressure turned men into calculators and decisions into defenses. Midway through these weeks, while Thomas sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a warm mug and the rain had learned to comb the window in steady lines, Jade came by and sat without preface. She brought with her a small bag of pharmacy-grade kitten milk, and in the quiet between them she asked the question that is part audience and part counsel. Have you ever had an animal wait for you when you didn't ask them to? Her voice was soft. She knew it was a question whose answer might be a confession. Thomas found that he could answer honestly. She waited, he said, and perhaps I am only now remembering how to be waited for. The question landed upon more than an answer. It offered Thomas a mirror in which he could see the change in himself. He had been, until Morrow, a man who believed himself damaged beyond the capacity to care. Now he recognized his hands as instruments of kindness rather than tokens of loss. Jade smiled in that precise way volunteers have, the smile of someone who has watched similar recoveries in many houses. The shelter, she said, does not always manage to hold everything, but sometimes, she said, a household like his, steady, mild, obedient to the small mercies, becomes the difference between an end and a beginning. The weeks formed themselves into a tension of decisions. Thomas learned to check the thermometer hidden in the vet kit, as if it were sacred scripture. He woke at odd hours with fear that the small lives were slipping. Once, in a night of rain and shadow, he heard a sudden commotion in the kitchen and found Morrow restless, circling the basket as if rehearsing a birth she had not yet been scheduled to perform. He called Dr. Hale with the earnestness of a man who is discovering how loud the heart can be. The doctor advised patients the old and mortal counsel, yet added a warning about the dangers of premature labor. Thomas sat, hands sweating, and watched Morrow arrange her wool and press her chin into a raw space of the basket. As if to complicate the arithmetic of his life further, the landlord reappeared with a paper clipped to his thumb and a tone in his voice that was borderline civil and borderline threat. He had received a complaint. Someone, it seemed, had seen a number of animals and assumed an illegal hoarding. The accusation, idle and likely unfounded, required a response. The landlord suggested a meeting with the councilman, a polite but unspoken pressure to conform to the written rules. Thomas, who was learning the grammar of courage in small steps, felt the old fear that his attempt at kindness would be legislated into something like wrongdoing. He discovered, in that moment, the way community can both knit and cleave, how public opinion lives in the throat of a neighbor's rumor. He resolved to face the meeting with the quiet tempering of a man who had already made a choice. He would present his case with facts and the small dignity of responsibility. Tension, as it does, found its own momentum. The shelter sent an urgent note one morning. An outbreak of an upper respiratory infection had moved through several cages, and as a precaution those animals had been quarantined and treatment had begun. The notation carried an adjacency. More crowded cages, more stress for those animals, more pressure on the staff. Marta, in a voice that threaded both apology and firmness, asked if Thomas might consider fostering for a longer period should the kittens be born, and whether he could be ready for the possibility of temporary placements. He said yes. The word felt like a small oath. He did not yet know if he could keep it. Saying yes was a step into an uncharted country where the map only reveals itself as one proceeds. The turning point arrived not in the form of a heroism, but rather as the quiet compulsion of duty shifted by a single event. Morrow's labor began at the edge of dawn on a day when the sky held a rare clarity. Thomas woke before the kettle had a chance to mourn, and found the house in that delicate lit way that makes all things seem possible. He moved like one who had rehearsed this sequence in his mind while awake and asleep. Towels, warm water, the small lamp on the table that would not cast a harsh glare. He worked with steady hands because there was no other kind. The cat labored with a patience so absolute that Thomas felt both humbled and terrified. There was focus, the ancient thing of birth, and something else. A strain in the air that suggested not only the arrival of new life but the test of a fragile network. At the height of the effort, a phone call broke the thread. Marta's voice when she spoke was a thing of immediate consequence. The shelter had been visited by an inspector. Complaints had been lodged by a neighbor. The city code officer had been tipped. In 2 days a decision would be made if housing conditions were not brought into conformity. That information arrived like a winter wind, cutting through the tender heat of the birth. Thomas's hands did not falter. He delivered life into the world with the solemnity of a man who has seen enough to know that miracles and bureaucracy often live next door to one another. He wrapped the first kitten wet slick. A small miracle clenched into itself in a towel and felt the tiny pulse of a life whose whole history had yet to be written. And then, as if the world were intent on testing every fiber of his resolve, there came a sound at the door, a vehicle's engine and the quick, crisp clack of footsteps. Someone had come to speak of rules. The house, which only moments before had been a steady cove of new breaths, now braced itself for the possibility of being claimed by law. Thomas moved to the door with a kitten pressed against his chest, expecting a neighbor or an inspector. He opened the latch. Outside stood a man Thomas did not at first recognize, one from the shelter's records perhaps, or a stranger whose authority smelled of ink and council meeting. The man's jacket bore an emblem he could not place immediately, but his face carried the air of someone holding decisions. He spoke in a voice that had the habitual politeness of an officer delivering news one would rather not hear. "Mr. Hale?" he said, and in that misnaming Thomas understood that paperwork had already begun to right itself without his consent. He had minutes, perhaps hours, to answer questions he had not been given time to imagine. Inside the house a cat made a sound that was both a demand and a plea. Thomas felt the fragile edges of his world bend. The turning point was not a choice he contemplated so much as a circumstance into which he was thrust. To fight, to concede, to relocate, to relinquish. One of these would become the axis around which everything in the small house would turn. The cliffhanger hung there like a bird. The city officer's questions had only begun, and beyond them, a shadow whispered of consequences that could reach beyond a single household, to a small life newly born. Damp and uncomprehending in a towel, the house that had learned to breathe again now held its breath. Dawn had not yet surrendered to the certainty of morning when Thomas stood at the threshold with 3 damp kittens pressed to his chest and a man from the city's code office standing, with a folded paper and the punctual patience of authority. Rain had softened the world to a watercolor wash. Inside, the small lamp on the table cut one bright pool of pledging light. Morrow moved in the basket like an ancient drummer, capable of the slow and ruthless persistence that makes songs of survival. Her breath was a tide beneath Thomas's ribs. He smelled the mineral cold of the newborns and the warm animal scent that clung like an answer. All the world's rules seemed suddenly as brittle as dried leaves. "Mr. Hale," the officer said again, this time with the correct name, and with a tone that suggested the rectification of an earlier clerical misstep, but not the softening of consequence. He brandished a document neat with stamps. "We've had complaints. There are regulations about domestic animals and occupancy. We must ensure the welfare of the tenants of the house and the neighborhood. I'm given to understand you've had some recent changes." Thomas felt the inflation of a cloud of small papers, the shelter forms, Dr. Hale's medical notes, Marta's call. He laid on the table as if placing talismans. The printed agreement he had signed at the shelter, Dr. Hale's notes about Morrow's condition and the clinic's recommendation for monitoring, and the vet bill paid with receipts. He offered them like a man showing his passport to a wary sentinel. The officer read them, his eyes moving across the pages in the business-like rhythm of someone who has learned to protect a town by the weight of ink and regulation. He did not, though, appear convinced. "This paperwork helps establish that you are taking care of the animals," he said. "But the complaint suggests numbers above what is permitted in this residential area. There will be a hearing." The word landed with a dull solidity. Hearing. In the grammar of bureaucracy that meant time, forms, possibility of fines, perhaps orders to remove animals. For Thomas, it meant the prospect of being compelled to surrender the 3 little lives he had already cradled. He felt the old ghost of helplessness stir, the one that had taught him to measure his days by small rituals. and now something inside him answered with a precise fury, not rage for its own sake, but the fierce, clean protection that arises when one who once despaired finds there is a thing left to guard. The officer, patient as a gate, added that complaints often came from neighbors alarmed not only by numbers but by smells, by noise, by the sense of disorder. Thomas thought with a quick and private apology of the kettle that sometimes boiled over, of the litter box he had bought in a tremor of generosity, of the occasional clamor of a kitten discovering voice. None of those seemed to him worthy of bureaucratic condemnation, but the officer's job was not to adjudicate tenderness. It was to adjudicate standards. In the middle of the official exchange, the smallest of the kittens, a thing the size of a walnut with fur still damp from life's seam, stirred and let out a tiny, urgent cry. Morrow answered with a commanding call that was both song and compass. Thomas's world narrowed to that moment. The officer's polite sentences became wind in the background. He set the kitten on the table to check its breathing and found it shallow, a whisper of puff that required immediate attention. Dr. Hale's note about low milk reserves echoed in his head as if in a cave. If nursing failed, formula and heat would be necessary. If not provided, mortality might creep in like fog. Thomas looked up. The officer watched with professional curiosity. Then, in a move that was either impulse or destiny, Thomas lifted the tiny creature into his hands and ran. He ran not toward a distant animal hospital but across the lane to Mrs. Pendleton's house, where the old woman had a history of remedies and a readiness to requisition anything for life's small urgencies. She greeted him not with the reproof of a neighbor whose order he had upset, but with a hand that knew how to clasp and steady. She produced, as if she had anticipated such a moment for years, a small ceramic lamp and a bag of old wool. Her eyes held a softness that suggested she had once been called upon by things not entirely her own, and had answered, because answering had been the only right thing to do. Back at his own kitchen table, the argument resumed, now with the jangling tempo of an emergency. Thomas set a makeshift heat nest beneath the lamp, wrapped the kitten in Mrs. Pendleton's wool, and coaxed a drop of the special kitten milk Jade had left into its mouth with the care of a surgeon and the tenderness of someone who speaks apologies to small things. The kitten accepted and then slept, that fragile sleep of those who have been promised warmth. The officer watched without intervening, as if the life he had seen in a small bundle had a claim on his own measure of justice. He had the look of a man whose work had taught him to weigh complaint against consequence. There was a glint of something in his face now, an awareness that the neatness of a rule might be cruel when applied without discretion. He cleared his throat. "We will proceed with a temporary injunction until there is a hearing," he said. "For now you will ensure proper care. We will contact the shelter and the animal control liaison. We need to verify health and occupancy." Thomas heard the formality and the mercy in the officer's voice. The temporary injunction meant a legal mark, a notice on the record. It was not the end, but neither was it assurance that what they had would be left untouched. He felt the hinge of his choice swing. He could be crushed by the letter of the law, or he could shape the letter into something that carried a human edge. Advocacy, appeals, testimony. He did not have to make that decision alone. Jade and Marco arrived at the mention of temporary. They came with the readiness of people who had built their lives out of answering small emergencies. They formed a quiet human cordon that reassured the officer of manifold reality. This was not a hoarder's den. This was a household under duress, making a careful effort to be responsible. Dr. Hale came as well, breathless from the clinic, with a folder of medical notes and an estimate of what might be needed: supplemental formula, a heat lamp, safe bedding. He spoke in economic terms and tender ones, making the case both with the ledger and with the story of the living. The hearing, the paper said, would be scheduled in 3 days. The officer left a copy of the injunction and a soft admonition that the council took welfare complaints seriously. The moment the door closed behind him, the house exhaled. But it was not the exhale of relief. It was the humorless breath of someone who knows the fight has only just begun. Thomas spent that day like a man learning a new arithmetic of courage. He called the shelter, and Marta promised to attend the hearing, to supply records, and to advocate that small practical kindnesses could be proof of responsibility. He spoke to the landlord with the blunt honesty of a person who had nothing left to conceal. The landlord, who had feared the expenses of law rather than the ethics of kindness, surprised Thomas by offering testimony about his own daughter's rescue cat, and how such things could be messy, but ultimately worthy of protection. A neighbor, surprised perhaps by the courage he had seen when Thomas had run for help, volunteered to bring a written statement about the hours of noise and found them ordinary. In the deep hours of that night, Thomas sat with the kittens like a man reading scripture in the language of breath. He thought of Lily and the difficult mercy in her sayings. She would have said that love is a practice. He knew now what she had meant. Love asks you to show up in small ways when it is easier to stay away. He told the kittens, to the wet curls, to the tiny paws, to the heat that rose from the lamp, that they had arrived into a house that would fight for them. He felt no heroism in the words, only the clear obligation of a man who had promised. The next morning, as if fate wanted to be particular in its cruelties, the shelter called with a grave tone. There had been an outbreak, a respiratory virus affecting animals in the area. They were short-staffed and short of space. Fierce even. Marta told him gently that if the hearing did not go well and if the shelter could not promise intake, the options might shrink. She said the shelter would do everything it could but placed the same heavy truth between them. Systems have limits. Thomas learned how to conduct a campaign in 3 days. He wrote a clear, quiet statement, the shelter forms, receipts for vet care, the photos of the kittens' first hours, wet and luminous, printed and bound with the careful hands that had once made Lily's garden tidy. He gathered testimony from Dr. Hale, from Jade and Marco, from Mrs. Pendleton, from the baker and the boy with the loose laugh. Each person's note was a thread showing the fabric of his small life. He wrapped them and took them to the council hall, a little man carrying a parcel of hope. The hearing room smelled of varnished wood and stale coffee. It was a place where rules had weight. The councilman, composed in his gray suit, listened with the patience of those trained to be both judge and public servant. The complaint was brought by a neighbor who lived across the lane. She appeared in the form of a woman whose tidy life had been discomposed by the presence of animals. She spoke of smells and sounds and of a fear of the unknown. Her testimony was precise, framed in the civility of unmet expectations. Thomas's turn came. He rose with hands that had steadied in the saddle of new responsibility, and he spoke without theatrics. He explained the shelter call, the paperwork, the medical attention, the temporary injunction. He had brought the rubber plant's leaf pressed in a book, almost as a personal emblem. The plant that had kept him awake with the sense that growth might continue. He held it very briefly between his fingers as if to show that the smallest reverences mattered. He told the story plainly, of Morrow's patient wait at his door, of the kitten's first breath, of the night spent coaxing warmth. He did not beg. He offered evidence. He invited the council to see not a lawbreaker, but a citizen learning an uncommon kind of care. When he finished, Dr. Hale spoke, a short, expert testimony on the cat's health and the reasonable measures Thomas had taken. Marta offered to take the kittens into shelter, care should the hearing demand it. But she insisted the family unit should be preserved if at all possible. Mrs. Pendleton, with the blunt grace of the aged, testified about the incident where Thomas had come to her in the rain with the tiny creature propped against his chest. How life arrived at one's door, and how kindness had answered. Even the landlord gave a short statement about Thomas's steady habit of paying rent and keeping the garden in good order. He could not imagine a man of such mannerhood as a hoarder. The council deliberated in the small, confidential room where civic decisions become less public and more human. They returned with an outcome neither victory nor defeat. They would allow the animals to remain in Thomas's care for a probationary period, conditional on follow-up inspections, on proof of veterinary care, and on a limit to numbers. The injunction would remain on the record pending further review, but there was not to be an immediate removal. It was a small mercy balanced with a reminder that law watched. Thomas felt relief and a bruised understanding of the precariousness of kindness under papered rule. He left the hall with a paper stamped with cautious permission, and the sensation that the fight for the small lives had been both won and continued. The kittens, he thought, had secured a reprieve by virtue of their need. The law, he reflected, found room when it could see evidence of sober stewardship. He had learned the use of papers and the economy of names. Documentation was a kind of sacrament in the world that judged by ink. The moment of triumph, however, was not the end of contest. It was the threshold to another truth. That very evening, as the house settled in the dim hour before sleep, Morrow began to cough. Not the sweet, soft nuzzle of contentment, but a hacking that shook her small body. Dr. Hale's words, watchful waiting, had become a yoke that felt suddenly too light. He watched her gasp and saw in her eyes the ancient animal guard against pain. He called Jade, woke her from sleep, and the two of them sat in patient vigil as the night lengthened into a long, taut string. They worked with the careful, trembling urgency of those who have learned to be curators of fragile life. They administered steam to ease her breath, warmed her body with towels, fed medication with measured patience. The kitten in Thomas's arms, the one with the tentative breath, snored in that relieved way of the newly tucked. Morrow's cough slowed, but the night did not release its tension, and then in the thin and honest hour before dawn, Marta called. The shelter had been forced, in a separate matter, to take steps with a neighboring property, an estate that had been the source of multiple surrender calls, and in the process, staff had found several animals whose histories were tangled in paperwork. One of the animals was the queen of a small feline circle, whose owner had died months before, and whose line now counted more mouths than beds. Marta's voice, sharp with the fatigue of those who keep long watches, hinted that resources were strained and options precarious. She could not promise a place for every orphan if the city ordered immediate remediation in crowded cases. Thomas felt the sentence move through him like a weather change. The reprieve had been provisional, the shelter's capacity precarious, and Morrow's cough still knifed the night. He held the small life against his chest and made a decision that would be the measure of his metamorphosis. If the law and the calendar could compel him to surrender what he had promised to protect, he would not do so without offering to secure each new life a pathway that did not pass through the cold instruments of shelters that might, in shortage, make hard choices. He would not, could not, let the kittens be numbered into a fate he had the power to oppose. The decisive moment arrived with the bluntness of necessity. He called the shelter and spoke into a receiver like a man who has only one instrument left: persistence. He requested, with a voice that had the relentlessness of a river finding its bed, that the clinic be given a temporary license to keep the kittens until they were old enough for a calm adoption process. He promised funds for care, he pledged to do paperwork, he arranged a roster of volunteers to hold watch. Marta listened, astonished and grateful. She promised to convene staff and to push for administrative discretion. It would require signatures, forms, a volley of emails, and the goodwill of people who kept their jobs by balancing compassion against rules. It could be done, but only if Thomas could demonstrate commitment and the kittens could be stabilized. They worked through the long day and into the night. Thomas, who had once been a man who measured courage by the distance between kettle and sink, found his life condensed into lists and the careful administration of warmth. He learned to syringe a kitten gently, to watch liver color as if it were a map, to read the way a small chest rises and falls, and to take that movement as either blessing or alarm. Morrow slept fitfully, but her cough became a small receding weather. The kittens, brimful of quick, bright trust, learned to root at his fingers and to purr the soft thing that repairs human fear. And yet the world did not yield wholly to his efforts. Late that afternoon, as his pulse thudded with the rhythm of duty, the landlord arrived with a glassy-eyed man whose card bore the emblem of the county animal control officer. He carried a formal notice. The paper, official, stamped, inevitable, declared a property inspection to take place the following morning. It asked for immediate compliance with an inventory of conditions, maximum numbers of domestic animals, sanitation verification, and proof of vaccinations. The inspector's presence smelled not of justice, but of potential confiscation. Thomas read it and felt something cold fan through his chest. He had bought time. He had mobilized care. He had given the kittens warmth and the shelter's blessing, but tomorrow promised another form of judgment. Physical inspection and inventory that could translate into mandatory removal, should anything be found wanting. He walked the house that night as the lamp threw its small, faithful circle across the floor and felt the world narrow to the diameter of the basket. He thought of Lily and the rubber plant that had kept growing despite winter. He imagined the plant's leaves like flags of persistence. He thought of the small mercies he had been taught and the ones he had learned to practice. He slept in a chair with the kittens on his chest, with Morrow pressed against his feet. He woke with the dawn and found his hands steadier than they had been in months. When the inspector arrived, it was with a gravity that made the house feel like a small vessel on a stern sea. He moved through rooms with the tempo of an auditor and a priest, checking boxes that would determine whether, in law, the small lives could remain. He examined vaccination records, shone a light into the kitten's eyes, and knocked at the small bowl where the rubber plant sat by the window. At one point he paused, as if reading a line of poetry in a language he had not expected. He made note of the neat stacks of invoices. The signature forms from the shelter, Doctor. Hale's notes, Marta's letter pledging to support, and he asked in a voice that had learned to parse excuses, "Who else knows of these animals?" Thomas answered with the names that formed a small chorus of witnesses. Mrs. Pendleton, Doctor. Hale, Jade, Marco, the landlord. Testimonies of human witness bound to the practical facts of care. The inspector listed them with the solemnity of someone cataloging evidence for mercy. He took the papers and promised to make a report that would go with his recommendation. It felt for a moment that the world had tilted and found some improbable balance. The inspector left, not with the clank of authority, but with the patient promise to report. Thomas felt as if he had pressed his fingers into the soft place of the world, and found that for now it yielded. He had stood with his small lives, and the law had listened with the ear of those who keep watch. And then, as the sun tipped toward the edge of afternoon and the kitchen filled with the leoparded light of late day, a message arrived on his phone that would make the rest of the story not merely precarious but unbearably, exquisitely uncertain. It was a call from the shelter's emergency line. A transport carrying a number of animals had arrived that morning from several estates, and among them, buried in paperwork, overwhelmed by numbers, were several litters. The shelter was requesting immediate assistance in placement. The message ended with a line that felt like an incantation of doom. If we cannot secure fosters or placements within 48 hours, we will have to make triage decisions. 48 hours. The number, plain and machine-like, felt like a countdown that could erase the small victories Thomas had achieved with his papers and his pleas. It meant that even the shelter's compassion had limits. It meant that a shortage might again tilt life toward the calculus of ends. Thomas felt the ground of certainty shift beneath him. He had fought in the council chamber and at the inspector's, door and in the nights feeding milk. He had summoned witnesses and endured injunctions. He had met law with proof and mercy with persistence. Yet the core question snapped into a focus so fine it almost hurt. Would the fragile new breaths he had cradled survive the shape of systems that struggled with scarcity? He stood in the pool of lamplight and looked at the damp fur of the kittens curled against his palm. He felt at once weary and newly sharp. In that hour he understood the last and truest test of his transformation. Not the papers he could gather, nor the neighbors he could marshal, but the depth of his refusal to let necessity determine the value of life. The decisive act was not yet done. It would require more papers, more persuasion, perhaps the sacrifice of money and sleep and the comfort of a man who had once only kept plants alive. He drew a breath and stepped to his desk. He pulled out the passport of small, stubborn human things, the rubber plant's leaf, the knitting of community testimony, the calls to the shelter, and began to assemble, with the precise industry grief had taught him, a plan. He sat down and wrote in a steady hand, to every place that might be moved. Volunteers, animal charities, neighbors. He pledged funds. He offered his home as an example of the way that law and care might intersect if citizens learned to do the difficult work of keeping the vulnerable. He did not know at that moment if his work would be enough. The cliff of consequence stood before him, 2 days for the shelter's triage decision, a pending review by the inspector, and a city whose mercy was distributed in the fold of numbers. He had done all a man could do. He had also discovered a new courage that would not be measured in forms alone. The house settled again into its anxious liminality. Morrow slept fitfully, the kittens warmed and fed. Outside, the town went on, with its baker folding bread like a benediction into the window. Inside, Thomas watched the small chests rise and fall. He had stood up in the face of law and found that his voice could be heard. He had learned how to marshal the town's small kindnesses, Yet he knew the battle was not concluded. The cliffhanger of fate hung, 48 hours, a pending report, a record that might tilt decisions, and he felt, with a sudden, keen tenderness, the full weight of what he had chosen to protect. Would you stay, if you were in their place? The hours that followed were not heroic in the grand sense. They were a succession of small, persistent stewardships that together resembled a life redirected. Thomas moved through them like a man who had learned to read the weather by the moss underfoot. Attentive, careful, unwilling to be surprised again by the soft invasions of fate. He set about the work he had promised, calling contacts, organizing schedules, marshaling receipts into neat packets, and found each time a call was answered with a yes, that the world's mercy lived in tiny acknowledgments. People said yes because, when offered a clear request, many prefer to be helpers than bystanders. Jade and Marco became his closest allies. Jade, whose laugh could smooth the edges of a raw evening, coordinated a roster of fosters who might take kittens should the shelter's need become absolute. Marco, with the economy of a man who had learned to make charity precise, put together a list of supplies and volunteers who could transport animals in an emergency. They moved with the efficiency of those who have practiced this economy of care. Dr. Hale tightened up monitoring schedules and wrote a formal petition to the county inspector detailing the medical needs and the treatment plan. Marta sat in her office among invoices and lists and became, for Thomas, a kind of general whose arms reached into the town's hidden reserves of goodwill. Each act of help was a small rope thrown across the current. Mrs. Pendleton brought more wool and a hot water bottle from her drawer marked, "For sudden storms." The baker left crusts at the gate like small offerings of sustenance. The boy, with the loose laugh, stood in the lane with a sign he'd made, simple, childish, earnest, asking neighbors to sign a petition in support of the little family in Thomas's house. The landlord, who had once been the paper's stern voice, came with a folded statement acknowledging Thomas's responsible rent and the cleanliness of the property. The man's eyes, usually hidden behind ledger-thin civility, betrayed a warmth that confessed to a difficult sympathy. He had a granddaughter who adored cats, he said, and had learned his measurements of law may sometimes be bent by tenderness. The inspector's report came like a careful tide. The man who had visited the house returned office papers that contained both inventory and a commentary that astonished Thomas by its humanity. He had noted the cleanliness, the up-to-date vaccinations, and the community testimony now collected. He had also scrutinized the presence of a documented veterinary plan and the outreach to volunteer fosters. In the balance of his professional duty, he found that the house warranted not confiscation, but conditional support. He recommended that, so long as Thomas maintained records and conformed to capacity limits, the family could remain until such time as the shelter could ensure placements if necessary. The recommendation passed along with a suggestion: the county would expedite a temporary foster license if the clinic agreed to be a supervising entity. Dr. Hale agreed. It was a procedural opening that felt like a miracle because it made room. The shelter's triage countdown, 48 hours that had once threatened to swallow them, stretched into the language of contingency rather than inevitability. Marta and Thomas negotiated the terms with the shelter's administrative committee. They arranged, with practical reserve, that if any litter required placement beyond Thomas's ability to keep, the clinic could hold them under the temporary license. If he could manage to stabilize them until old enough for calm adoption, he might keep them. The compromise required lists and signatures, small rituals of trust that the town seemed suddenly eager to offer. Life, as it does, continued to be tastier in small things. The rubber plant, a green flag that had once shown Thomas how to obey hope, sent out a new leaf the morning the county signed the temporary license. He saw the fresh green as if it were a benediction. The plant, which had been a witness to the house's hardest seasons, seemed now to declare in its slow, steady way that tending matters. Morrow took to sleeping near its pot, her warm flank a neat arch beneath the leaf's quiet reach. The plant's new growth was not a grand sign, but a small, stubborn affirmation that life will often respond to the modest demands of care. Morrow's recovery proceeded in an uneven arc. The cough, having once sounded like a verdict, lost its harshness as the antibiotics and steam and careful warmth did their work. She grew steadier, more willing to make short sorties to explore the corners of house and garden. Her milk came in modestly and then with assured generosity. Thomas watched with the careful reverence of a man reading sacred texts, as the kittens found their mouths and the rhythm of nursing. He moved through nights now with less of that taut, ragged terror that had gripped him in the worst hours. The small creatures, bracken, mallow, and juniper, names he said aloud like small prayers, began to unfurl. Their eyes opened to the slanted sun and the sound of the kettle. Their mewling changed from the guileless plead of a newborn to the rougher, more adventurous demands of toddlers in fur. Community did not rest on gestures alone. Practical offers turned into steady help. The baker's extra crusts became a predictable hour of nourishment. The boy with the sign took to dropping in with toys and the serious questions of a child learning what philanthropy feels like. Mrs. Pendleton ran a schedule of clean bedding that ensured hygiene beyond what paperwork required. Jade and Marco taught Thomas how to prepare the kittens for adoption photographs, making their small features appear in light with the dignity they deserved. Neighbors who had only once worried about smells now brought canned food for the adult cat and offered to mind the house during his rare absences. The town, which had once balanced on the edge of suspicion, folded into an alliance of kindness. The landlord, whose ledger had once been a blunt instrument of regulation, became an unlikely ally. The man introduced Thomas to his granddaughter, who arrived wide-eyed and untroubled by the legal language adults bring to such things. Seeing the girl hold a kitten with careful hands, the landlord said quietly that his measure of property had changed since his wife had died and left him to measure losses. He told Thomas in a tone that had the gravity of confession that the law is meant to protect citizens, but not to smother them. He offered to host for a weekend a small adoption day in his garden should the town wish to meet the kittens. The offer was as practical as it was symbolic, a sign that the house's integration into civic life had been accomplished by more than paperwork. It had been achieved by reciprocity. Marta, who had navigated the shelter's storms for years, continued to press the administrative envelope until bureaucracy bent toward humanity. She found spaces on waiting lists, partners among smaller rescues who could take kittens in groups, and adopted a quiet, furious optimism that refused to let the triage countdown become a sentence. When she announced, with the careful satisfaction of someone who had rearranged a small constellation of resources, that the kittens could remain with Thomas until they were old enough for a calm adoption process, and that the clinic's temporary license was approved, his relief almost made him speechless. He felt in that moment as if he had been given back the right to be fallible and brave at once. The climbing away from crisis allowed room for the subtler payoffs that the house had been assembling since the rubber plant first took root. The leaf that had unfolded the morning of the license marked more than a botanical fact. It had become a sigil of continuity. Thomas began in small ways to restore things Lily had loved. A bowl cleaned and placed back on the shelf, a small garden pruning, the watering of the plant as if it were a daily benediction. He learned to move among the house's furniture with a memory that was not grief alone, but a measured gratitude for what remained. He found himself talking to Morrow and the kittens about trivial things, about the weather, about the way the kettle sang. Conversations that were less futile than they sounded. Each small habit stitched him to the day he was living rather than the day he had lost. The moral weather of the town shifted too. People who had once seen the household as an anomaly came to view it as a model. A man who, when faced with bureaucratic pressure, had learned to marshal help rather than hide. The councilman who had listened at the hearing wrote a brief note of commendation after witnessing the coordinated plan of care and the way neighbors had rallied. The inspector's final report, submitted after a follow-up visit, read that the household had demonstrated sober responsibility and community support. It was dry and official, but Thomas read the words like a benediction. Yet not all debts of heart are repaid in tidy sentences. There remained in Thomas a quiet residue of fear, a memory of how quickly a schedule can calcify into a decree. He knew now, in the marrow, how swiftly one could be forced to choose between what is compassionate and what is permissible. That caution kept him vigilant. He maintained records with a diligence bordering on ritual. He kept the rubber plant's leaves dusted and healthy, as if each leaf were an entry in a ledger of mercy. He continued to collect signatures and to attend meetings. He had learned to speak the language of both kindness and law, and in the overlap of those tongues he found greater possibility. Morrow, now more robust, took to the role of mother, with a gravity that suggested she had always known the script. She taught the kittens to hunt in the harmless sense cats teach, the sudden pounce at a ribbon, the careful encirclement of a toy mouse, the art of waiting for the exact moment. Watching her, Thomas understood that animals do not moralize. They demonstrate. A cat's care is not a sermon. It is an act. Seeing Morrow's calm authority made him feel both awed and small, as if he were the novice called to learn the simplest lessons. The kitten's progress became the tidy chronicle of his own transformation. Where once he had kept a plant alive and nothing more, now he kept small lives thriving. In the weeks that followed the crisis, the adoption day in the landlord's garden arrived like a small fair of humanity. Neighbors came, curious and eager to witness the fruit of the town's labor. The landlord's granddaughter held a kitten with careful hands. The baker brought scones. Mrs. Pendleton arranged her smallest cushions so visitors could sit and learn about fostering. People met and spoke the kind of sentences that knot a town together, about work and weather and the way a small rescue can change one's afternoon. Several guests fell silent when they saw the kittens, and when one of them, a woman with a steady voice, asked to adopt Juniper, Thomas found that his heart allowed an easy, generous answer. The kitten left in a carrier, but with a promise and with names swapped and telephone numbers shared. Small departures were replaced by small arrivals, hands that would build new homes and record new stories. Not every goodbye in that season was easy. Bracken, the most bold, was adopted by a family with a child who had asked for a companion for the long winter evenings. Mallow, shy and soft, found a home with an older woman who had lost a companion years before and sought again the quiet comfort of a living warmth. Each adoption felt like the completion of a small circle. The shelter's plea had been answered, the community had rallied, and the small lives had been given paths that did not include the catalog of scarcity. Morrow stayed, not because she was required to, but because Thomas had made a place for her of careful attention and mutual regard. She slept by the rubber plant's pot, and sometimes knocked gently at the watering can to remind him that both plant and life require regular tending. The house settled into a new grammar. The rubber plant's leaves were now a record of seasons. Old leaves trimmed with a careful hand, new ones unfurled like small flags of victory. Thomas learned to accept that his life had been bent by grief into an instrument of care. He no longer thought of himself as robbed, but as entrusted. People in town would stop at his gate and ask after the cat and the plant, and he would answer with the simple accuracy of a man who has learned how to keep promises. The old ache remained. Grief is not a thing to be cured, only companioned, but its edges had softened under the ministrations of responsibility and community. There were quiet renderings of lesson everywhere. The boy with the loose laugh who had held the sign later returned to volunteer at the shelter, his life tipped toward advocacy by a small, serious exposure to need. Mrs. Pendleton, who tended roses like prayers, began to keep a small tin of spare wool for any who might need it. The landlord's granddaughter taught a neighbor's child how to cradle a small beast without frightening it. The town's moral universe felt slightly recalibrated toward the idea that courage is not only in grand action, but in the patient obligations of caring for the vulnerable. Thomas, in the cadence of days, found an inner rhythm he had not expected. He would water the rubber plant each morning, check the ledger of vaccinations, and answer calls from those who needed advice on fostering. He kept a small notebook where he recorded dates and minor triumphs. One kitten's first purr, another's first exploratory tumble. In those entries he noticed the small detail of his own remaking. The man who had once used lists to measure distance between grief and the world now used them to weave a net of practical affection. He moved among neighbors with an eased step. He allowed himself to smile at little things. He took up little acts of courage, the sort that insist upon themselves in the tucked corners of life, and found them adding up, like leaves into a canopy. When the shelter finally cleared the last of the administrative hurdles and the temporary license was closed with formal thanks to the clinic, Thomas sat at his kitchen table and looked at the rubber plant. Its leaf, now fully unfurled and glossy, seemed to lean with a quiet approval he accepted like a benediction. He had been tested by law and by the frailties of systems. He had been called to choose not once but many times. The choices had not been theatrical. They had been quotidian, the kind that measure character in how one answers small emergencies. Has an animal ever changed your life in a way you didn't expect? The small house settled into a new kind of peace, not the hollow absence that had once made each room a tribunal of memory, but a peace shaped by action and patched together with ordinary duties. Thomas rose each morning to a light that no longer trembled with indecision. It was a steady, patient thing that asked nothing of him but to keep breathing. The rubber plant, whose single leaf had once been a quiet apostle of resilience, sent out a second and then a third new shoot. He learned to name them in the whispering habit of gratitude. First leaf, then two, then quiet. He placed a small saucer beneath the pot and watched the soil accept water as if it were forgiveness. The plant's slow, stubborn green became the calendar by which he measured the small miracles of ordinary days. The months that followed braided themselves into the town's life like a tidy pattern. Adoption Day in the landlord's garden had become the first of many small festivals. Neighbors, once cautious and then curious, now gathered to meet litters and swap recipes and speak of the weather, as if it were a shared concern rather than private weather. The landlord's granddaughter, who had learned how to cradle a kitten without frightening it, taught a class at the community hall titled Little Hands, Gentle Hearts, and the boy with the loose laugh volunteered at the shelter on weekends. Mrs. Pendleton's roses seemed to bloom with the more vigorous color of someone whose appetite for small acts had been renewed. The town stitched itself by these acts of shared attention. In their geometry, the ordinary became the heroic. Thomas kept his lists. The notebook where he recorded vaccinations, small triumphs, and neighborly favors sat now beside the plant. He wrote in it in the slow, deliberate hand a man acquires when he has learned to live under the obligation of care. There were entries that read like ledger lines. June 3rd, Bracken adopted, child named Sam. Others read like prayers. July 12th, Mallow's fear softened. 8, 3 times today. Each line had the sober weight of truth, and the lightness of the small things that keep a house from becoming a mausoleum. Morrow's role in the new order had shifted from recipient to teacher. For a while she had been a creature of patient need, a quiet patient at the center of Thomas's learning. Now she lived as midwife to the small lives she had produced and as friend to the man who had kept vigil. She taught the kittens to sit with the stillness of waiting, and to pounce with the decisive precision of someone who has learned timing. She brought Thomas in 100 tiny unremarked ways a code for living. A cat's lessons, when seen in the right light, are not sermons but demonstrations. How to be present without being intrusive. How to persist without pomp. Watching her, Thomas felt an education he had not sought, that patience is not a passive thing but an active war with distraction. The shelter's edge of crisis receded into a kind of memory that would, from time to time, come back with the sting of teaching. Marta wrote to him a short, serious note of gratitude and admonition. Shelters are not places to be offloaded and forgotten. They are organs of the town's compassion, and must be defended by citizens who show up. She reminded him that his work was an example and a caution both. How easy it is for systems to be strained. How essential that neighbors become one another's redundancy. He kept the letter, folded in the notebook, as if to preserve the sound of a voice that had been at once stern and kind. The legal steadiness they had won, the inspector's recommendation, the temporary license and its orderly closure, proved to be less an ending than a charter for a life lived beneath the auspices of shared responsibility. When county representatives wrote to ask about changing the animal ordinance to make room for compassionate allowances in cases of proven stewardship, the town's council asked Thomas to speak. He spoke without flourish, of a cat that had waited at his door, of a plant that would not be denied, of the way a community had chosen to answer rather than to ignore. He read from his little notebook, not as a boast but as evidence, receipts, witness names, the small signatures of those who had chosen to help. The act of speaking turned his private pledge into a public document, a story that would alter law by turning numbers into faces. His voice did not change the world by itself. Laws are the sum of many hands and many votes, but it nudged a conversation. The council took the anecdote and the evidence and shaped language that would permit temporary fosters under medical supervision, with safeguards against abuse. The ordinance shifted like a small boat adjusting its sail. It did not revolutionize the world, but it made room in the law for a principle, that compassion, when tethered to responsibility, should be accommodated rather than punished. Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction at this. and understanding that, at times, the point of good behavior is not only to save a thing, but to remodel the structures that might otherwise grind the tender into the routine of loss. Inside the house, the rubber plant's leaves grew broad and dark, and the little shelf by the window became an altar of small certainties. A pot of basil that he had planted because Lily had loved herbs, a small bowl of milk for Morrow that never sat empty, the notebook whose pages lay open like a daily hymn, on evenings when the light struck the wooden floor and the house sang with ordinary sounds, the kettle, a distant laugh, the patter of cat paws. Thomas would find himself thinking less of the loss that had once defined him, and more of the life that had begun to shape him in another way. Grief remained, persistent as a shadow, but it had altered contour. It no longer swallowed the whole of him, but walked by his side like a companion that taught prudence and tenderness alike. There were small moral reckonings in the quieter months. Thomas discovered that his own smallness was both his limit and his resource. He could not save every life. He could not rearrange the whole of the shelter's need. He learned to measure his efforts with the humility of one who knows the difference between doing all one can and hoping to carry the world. In accepting that boundary, he discovered a more honest courage, the patient, disciplined act of serving well within one's means. The town's adoption of a policy that allowed temporary licensure under clinical supervision meant that more people like him could be a bridge for lives in transit. He had not invented the principle, but his bedside vigils had been the anecdotal pressure that helped convert a rule into a mercy. The kittens who had gone to new homes were not forgotten. Bracken sent a photograph from time to time. Sam and Bracken wrapped in the blanket of the child's arms, both asleep like small conspiracies of warmth. Mallow sent sometimes a postcard with inked paw prints pressed into the margins. Juniper wrote, as it were, in the soft language of the new owner's life, with a calm account of her small adventures in a city apartment. The town made small rituals of staying in touch, a picnic where new owners were invited to meet one another, a charity event where the proceeds went to the shelter's veterinary fund. The lives that had once been at the edge of loss now had the neat geometry of continuity. Thomas found in the wake of this slow satisfaction a renewed capacity for small joys. He began to collect simple pleasures with the careful concentration of someone who had learned how to keep a world from fraying. On certain evenings he would brew tea and sit by the window with Morrow curled beside him, her purrs a steady engine against the hush. He read again from books Lily had loved, not to remember her more painfully, but to live again a practice they had once shared. He wrote a letter to a friend in the city about the way the plant leaned toward light and how kindness sometimes grows in the margins of small houses. He mailed the letter with a postage stamp chosen because it was blue and because small acts had a way of becoming hymns. A season turned, and with it came a quieter test. A woman arrived at his gate, an older stranger whose eye had an animal's knowledge. She carried in her arms a carrier small enough for a cat, and inside it a tabby with a limp tail and a slow, guarded breath. She told him, in a voice held close to the bone, that she had heard of the household that had stood for small lives. Her daughter had died the week before and had left behind a cat who could no longer manage alone. Would Thomas consider fostering? She did not ask with the entitlement of demand. She asked with the humility of one who had nothing left but the will to ask. Thomas looked at her and then at Morrow, who regarded the newcomer with all the unencumbered curiosity of a creature that does not ask for motives, only for a gentle hand. He agreed. The woman's name was Rose. Her cat, whose fur had once been glossy and now bore the soft matting of neglected seasons, received in Thomas's house a small catalog of attentions: warm baths, careful medication a corner by the plant. The act of sheltering Rose's cat felt to Thomas like a confirmation of his new grammar. It repeated the story he had already been writing, because kindness asked to be practiced often, not once. Rose stayed for tea, and in the course of that simple companionship, she told him of her daughter, of a life that had loved licorice candies and of a laugh like bells. They spoke in the unadorned language of bereavement and of the answer the town had given. Thomas listened and, in the answering, learned once again how the small acts of sheltering become the architecture of belonging. Morrow, for her part, took to the old cat with a philosopher's patience. She would sit near Rose's cat and purr in the deep, resonant way that mends small terrors. The old cat, who had feared hands and men until then, relaxed into the slow security of a house that had learned how to keep careful hours. Thomas watched this and saw the last and softest payoff begin to come into view. Animals are not just recipients of care. They are actors in the story of consolation. A mother cat's patience could relax the edges of grief in a woman's step. A plant's uncomplaining green could be a conversation starter across a kitchen table. He understood then, with the clarity of one who has seen a pattern at last, that world-changing does not always arrive in suitcases of grandeur. Sometimes it begins with a man who opens his door to a creature and in doing so opens himself to a new life. As seasons folded into a year the edges of the past which had once been raw, softened into a private plaque of remembrance. Lily's photograph remained small and modest on a shelf beside the plant. Thomas placed there a stone he had found on a beach once, smooth, dark, hollowed by tide, and a pressed leaf from the rubber plant. When he sat by the window in the late afternoons, he would take up the notebook and read aloud passages to the cat, as if to honor what had been and to certify what had become. There was still an ache. A life altered by loss is never entirely seamless, but there was now an arc that progressed from being defined by sorrow to being known for the work of sustaining tenderness. And Morrow, whose arrival at the threshold had once been an urgent punctuation, in his life now enacted a final gift. It came in a small, precise ritual that had the poetry of the animal world. One morning she stepped from the basket and, with the unhurried deliberation of one who chooses ceremonies, carried in her mouth a leaf torn from the rubber plant. She placed it gently by Lily's photograph and then sat back as if to say, in the language of presence, "Notice." The act was not dramatic. It was not a plea. It was an offering, simple and whole. Thomas felt the strike of the moment with the kind of astonishment formerly reserved for thunder. Here was the animal bringing the plant to the shrine, uniting two of the house's talismans into a single act. It was as if she had read the litany of his life and found a way to answer in a manner that made sense to cats, by furnishing the altar. That leaf, green, resilient, carrying the faint dust of the pot, became a seal on his new covenant. That sorrow could be companioned by duty, and duty could be renewed by love. He knelt and pressed his forehead to the small green thing and understood the universal truth that had been spoken to him in the course of one long, small year. That to keep another being is to be kept oneself. That the geometry of care returns to the giver. In a house that had once been a ledger of what was lost, there stood now a small shrine to what is given. Thomas understood finally that the story he had thought was about rescue was, in truth, about reciprocity. He had gone to the shelter to witness lives and left with his own life rewoven. The rubber plant, Morrow, and the kittens were not trophies. They were teachers. They instructed him in a pedagogy that required nothing but attentiveness, that small acts accumulate into structures of meaning, that community is the practice of answering when called. That law is at its best when it learns to listen to the small human voices that plead for mercy. When he walked down the lane now, the neighbors nodded with an ease that no longer carried the fainted edge of suspicion. Children waved. The baker handed him a roll as if the world were one continuous exchange of favors. The town's council sent a letter of thanks and an invitation to speak at an annual meeting about community involvement. He accepted with the same modest courage with which he had lived the past year and spoke not as one who had triumphed over difficulty alone, but as one who had learned how to ask for help and how to answer the call when it came for someone else. At night, when the house was dark and only the plant's leaves shone in the moonlight like small green coins, he would sometimes imagine Lily's voice in the quiet corners. He would whisper to the photograph and to the cat and to the plant, "We kept them." It was both a statement and a benediction. In it lay his final transformation. A man remade by the practice of daily compassion into someone who could both grieve and give. Grief, he learned, could be a companion that sharpened rather than flattened the impulse to care. There is a simple law of living, older than most policy and truer than many prayers. Small, consistent acts of kindness change the world more reliably than great intentions deferred. Thomas had discovered this in the slow arithmetic of leaves and purrs and late-night feedings. The truth, plain and unvarnished, is that community is not an abstract ideal, but a set of rooms where people bring blankets and bowls. It was in this humble catechism that his life found a satisfying closure. You stayed with me till the very end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft purr in your heart, subscribing helps me share more stories like this. If this story felt like a warm hug tonight, A subscribe lets me keep bringing you more moments like this.